Hey, listeners, welcome back to another episode of the Security Simplified podcast. We're most of the way through our Simplifying Information Governance series. Tonight, we're on episode 10, Information Security Policies. Just to recap, episode 9 last week, we talked about roles and responsibilities and why that's important to not just define, but formally define, document, and socialize with everyone that has a role or responsibility. Joining me tonight, I'm one of your co-hosts, Ryan Cloutier. Joining me is your other co-host, Evan Francine, and we're going to talk about one of our favorite topics tonight, which are information security policies, a critical component to a overall governance program. So, Mr. Evans, sir,
Yes.
you love information security policy.
Yeah, I'm one of those weirdos.
Policies for? What's the purpose of a policy?
Well, the reason why I like policies is I like being clear on rules, right? I'm a big stickler for not cheating. I'm a big stickler for not taking shortcuts. I think if you want to do things, you have to do them right. Our information security policies are reference documents. They're meant to be, the rules for how we do security in an organization. That's why I'm not a big fan of templates, unless you take those templates and actually, customize them for your governance structure, because I intend to use them. When the CEO or whoever approves the policies signs off, I expect to use them.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things, if it's used correctly, that policies are used for, is to help keep everybody inside the guardrails. A lot of organizations struggle with managing information security risk because of ineffective, incomplete, or absent policies. So it's very, very important to have them. And to Evan's point, you want to make sure your policies actually fit what you're doing. You actually create a different risk if you have policies that you don't adhere to. So you want to be very thoughtful about what you put in your policy, and you want to make sure that you can stick to what it is you wrote down and signed off on. So to that point, let's say we get a policy. Who in our organization is going to be responsible for approving that policy, and who's going to be responsible for implementing that policy change? What are your thoughts on that?
So, going off of what we talked about in last episode, my job as a CISO is to consult the business to make good risk decisions. So I would take the policy, write it with the CEO or whoever is ultimately responsible, maybe the CEO, maybe the board of directors. And I wouldn't expect them to write it, but I want to keep them abreast of what policies I'm writing and, how I'm writing them. I do expect them to, the CEO or the board of directors or both, to approve the policy with the understanding that this is your decision. It states what you want it to state. I just want to do, essentially what you're giving me the authority to do. Another thing that we lose track of, if I can't find what I'm doing as a security professional somewhere rooted in or governed by policy, I have no authority to do it. So if I'm doing things, I'm like, you know what, this really isn't covered by policy. That's a good indicator. You need to create a policy for that.
Yeah, and I like that you touch on that. I think for myself, in my career, I've run into two primary policy types. Non-technical policy, that really is that governing structure around information security and other aspects of the business, but it's that non-technical piece of the information security policy structure. And then there's the technical policy structure. If you think about encryption, for example, policy around encryption is an incredibly technical document. Now, we probably need a policy at that higher level that says, we're going to do everything to the best of our ability using industry best practice to protect information. And then the sub-policy of that becomes that specific encryption policy that dictates this system encrypted to this standard. So one thing to be careful when making policy, when organizing policy, is not to blend those two tightly together. You want to have the ability to be flexible in changing your technical policy as the landscape and threat environment changes. without having to necessarily go revisit some of those organizational level policies.
Absolutely. Policies are high-level documents. They're mandatory documents. They're not optional. We don't get to choose whether we follow them or not. Another thing that we see often as a mistake is many companies will have employees sign off that they've read and understood the policies. That's wrong because they're lying to you. Nobody reads policies. Just going to be honest with you. It doesn't matter what you do. They're not going to read the policy, but they're not meant to be read. And that's where people get this wrong. They are reference documents. They're read by one person. It's like when we go back to the board or, the board game that you buy at Target. Mm-hmm. When you open that board game, not everybody who sits down to play the game reads the rules. One person reads the rules. They then disseminate those rules to the other players of the game, meaning your employees. And then when there are questions, we go back and reference the rules. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? That's a good question. I'm not sure. I haven't encountered this before in our game. You go back. If it's there, then there's your rule. If it's not there, well, then you probably need to make a rule for that. They're meant to be living documents. The maintainer of these policies is the security team, or maybe you've put it in compliance, or maybe you've put it in chief legal or HR, whatever.
Right.
But yeah, policies, I think, and that's why policies get such a bad name. One, I think people struggle writing them because they're not sure what's supposed to go in them. And two, they don't use them right.
Well, and I like that you touch on that. I've seen so many policies that lack enforcement clauses, that lack, what do you do when the policy isn't followed? Like, that's an important part of policy. The other thing I see a lot of is policies developed in a vacuum. And this is my personal feel on it, but I believe the best policies are wrote in conjunction with and in participation with HR, the CEO, the CFO, right? We want to make sure that we're, writing something that's truly going to be effective and actually speaks to the risk that we're attempting to address by having this policy. Because that's really, policy is another form of managing risk, right? We're defining the boundaries. We're saying, here's how we operate within this, the rules of the game, so we don't wind up with pieces on the floor. But if information security only writes the policy in a vacuum, then I think you miss a lot of opportunities to have simpler policy language. I think you have miss a lot of opportunities to have a more effective and more enforceable policy.
Absolutely. You're going to be creating a game that nobody wants to play.
Right. And
if you want to have
Rise.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to create a game that everybody wants to play, so when you talk about roles and responsibilities like we did in episode 9, if I actually expect managers, directors, if I expect all people to follow my rules, well, then they need to feel like they have a say, like they want to play in this game with you. Another thing that we get as an excuse, that's a very common excuse around why you don't have policies is, well, if I put it down in policy and we're not doing it, then we're open to liability. And there's a really easy way around that. When you create your policies, every one of your policies should have a status associated with it. And the 3 statuses that I typically use in a policy is draft, approved, and adopted. So when it's a draft policy, that means your executive management, whoever is ultimately approving the policy, has not approved it yet. So you have no authority to go and implement the rules. When it becomes approved, then you move it from draft status to approved status. That doesn't mean we're doing it yet, right? There needs to be a period of time between the time that I approve this policy and the time that it actually gets implemented. When it is implemented and therefore open for auditing would be the adopted status, right? So you get away from, well, I put it in policy, but I'm not doing it. Does that leave me open to legal liability? Potentially, if you don't have your statuses, right? You need to have that out for yourself.
Absolutely. And, testing the policies is another area that we tend to fail at. So even if we get it to that, get it all the way through, and now we're doing it. We say we're doing it. Very few times do we check to see how effective It is. Is it really doing the thing we thought it would when we wrote it 6 months ago before we forgot about it? Is it really working for the business? Is it minimizing risk, or is it increasing it? I've seen policies wrote so poorly and circular that they contradict themselves and then create more risk than they solve.
Absolutely. And how often do you see policies that say should?
The future forward-looking language.
Well, right, because if policies are mandatory, then it's got to be must.
Correct.
Or thou shalt.
Will
right?
and must.
So giving yourself outs like that never work well. They also make it very difficult for us to audit against because, if our policies are not objective, well, then in your interpretation, we are compliant with the policy, but in mine, we're not. So make them as, again, reference documents. They should be high level enough to where they're understood by everybody who does reference these documents. And they need to be objective. They need to be cut and dry.
Every policy should open with purpose, objective, policy, enforcement, and then exception. That's another place we fail a lot, is to have a documented exception process for the policy in the policy. Now, that could be as simple as referring to another policy document where you manage exception, or you could get specific with the details of that particular exception, but you want to have that in there because there will be exceptions. So when you get audited, you don't get in trouble because, look, I accounted for that and I can show you where we made that decision and I can show you why we made that decision. And I have not met an auditor yet that's going to take you across the coals if you can show process behind how you arrived at the conclusion, unless it was something completely crazy.
Absolutely. And every organization has unicorn, situations or unicorn people where they're so special that they can't comply with your password policy for whatever reason. Fine. You need to go through the exception or the waiver process. All I need you to do is sign here. And then that usually gets them thinking, well, why do I need to sign? Well, because you're not compliant with the policy. That's okay. I just need you to sign that you're accepting the risk. And usually they're like, well, wait a second. Or they'll be like, they'll do it. But then you've got defensibility when that auditor does come around and,
right.
I didn't do it.
The last piece I'll add to that is exceptions need to be time boxed and reviewed. There is no perpetual exception. Don't make that mistake. Don't write a permanent exception because that will be considered a standard. You want to have a review process. The most aggressive I've seen is quarterly. The least aggressive I've seen is annually. But you have to go back and do those reviews. Even if you accept that exception again, somewhere you need to have tracked that you had that review, that yes, you reauthorized the exception, and here's the business case why.
For sure. And knowing that policies are reference documents, it's really important to create these topic-specific policies as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to put all of the rules in one big, long policy because it makes it really difficult for me to find what I'm looking for in those policies. To make them more referenceable, break your policies out by specific topics, whether it be acceptable use policy, an incident management policy, an asset management policy, an auditing policy. So that if I have questions about asset management, it's really easy for me to find that information. For myself and for all the employees, when we publish policies, we put them in a place where they're prominently displayed, where people can find them. That'll cut down on a lot of the questions back and forth, and it'll also, give them less excuses for why we're not, why we're doing this or not doing that.
Exactly. So as we get ready to kind of wrap this out, let's talk for a minute about standard policy. So we hear this a lot. It's standard. It's standard to have that. It's standard to have that. So I'm of the opinion there are a handful of fundamentals that are kind of agreed upon as being a minimum, right? I need some kind of something around background checks. I need some kind of something around acceptable use. Password ideally is one of those standards. So when you hear people talking about standard, it's standard. What they're saying is the topic not the details of the policy. There is no standard detail level in a policy. That's got to be unique to your business, to your risks, to your risk appetite, all these things, to your governance structure, like we're talking about. But what is standard, and Evan, jump in and correct me if you disagree on this, but what is standard are those big bucket topic areas. And there are some foundational ones, about 15 to 20, that pretty much any auditor is going to expect you to have. Pretty much any security person is going to expect there to be something within those topics. But the specifics, there can't be a standard, because if you standardize it, it doesn't work, because it has to fit your unique business needs.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we know that people, here at Security Studio, we know that people struggle with policies. Mm-hmm. So we have some excellent policy templates that are written by, information security experts with 20, 30 years experience. If you go to https://securitystudio.com/policy-templates, that's a great place for you to get started. It's completely free. It's ungated. It's part of our mission. When we see things that people struggle with that don't require a whole bunch of work, we'll make them freely available. So I encourage people to go there. They'll give you some good ideas of what maybe some of the standard policies are, whether you talk about identity and access management, or you mentioned earlier encryption management, software development, and acceptance, whatever policies. So if I develop software, I'd probably want to have a policy for how I develop that software. So to your point, your policies have to match your mission. Your policies have to match your governance. Your policy has to match your organization, your management style. If I'm the CISO, rarely can I use somebody else's policy templates, because I have such a different management style than other CISOs. So it's probably not going to fit for me. But that's a great place for you to get started. We don't want people to struggle with this. And if you don't have policies, or you know that this is a place where you struggle, don't put it off. And don't put it off. Trust me, get it documented, get it done.
And you can always improve. Don't worry about perfection. Seriously, something beats nothing every day of the week. The last thing I'll say on policies, and this is for my K-12 people, an information security policy is a very specific type of document. It should not be confused with a school board policy. There's a little bit of confusion in the way that term is used. A school board policy should authorize the chief technology officer or the delegate of the superintendent to design, develop, and implement information security policy. And at that URL Evan mentioned, if you are a K-12 and you're listening, we do have a school board policy template available for you as well. Looking forward to getting into next week. We're going to talk about the other leg of this stool: guidelines, standards, and procedures. And what are these? And a lot of times people interchange these terms, but they do have unique and individual meanings. Anything to add as we close out?
No, it's very good. Seems like boring, dry stuff, but trust me, it's very helpful and reliable, especially when you do have those breaches, or when you have somebody asking, what your policy is on these things. You don't want to be like, oh, crap, we don't have a policy. That leaves you open to a whole bunch of exposure.
Well, awesome and excellent. Two of my favorite words. We have enjoyed you guys being here, and we will see you again next week with episode 11.
Awesome. Take care. Are you stopping it, or am I?